what you're describing is fascinating given the times, right? Given recent invoking of emergency powers in Canada, for example, the Prime Minister did. How do you think these things are related?
I think we live in the logic of that essay. I think that the leftists who hung on most every word that Herbert Marcuse spoke and wrote in the 1960s and 1970s have shaped leftist thought and leftist politics for a long time now. And they genuinely believe that they have a right to move society forward and therefore to repress the right and to advance the causes of the left. They call it, you might call it leveling the playing field, if you will. And I think that we actually live in the logic of this essay. I saw it most explicitly, we can invoke, Justin Trudeau bringing out the emergency powers to quash the trucker freedom honking or whatever movement this is. I saw on the 1st of January this year, for example, the New York Times, I believe, titled, "Every day is January 6th now." We constantly live in a condition of clear and present danger, just like Marcuse advocated. And I think that this mentality has been the mentality of the left for decades now, and it's only just at this moment becoming absolutely clear that that's how they feel entitled to act in this way, that leftist things that are revolutionary or progressive in orientation are absolutely acceptable. Riots all through 2020, all these violent protests, etc. And we were told that we have to accept these, that they're mostly peaceful. They were 93% peaceful, whatever it is. And then, there's the bizarre event here at the Capitol on January 6th, 2020, then there's this trucker thing, and it's absolutely fascism and the worst insurrection, worse than Pearl Harbor, as bad as the Civil War. Every day is January 6th now. I just saw an article that Joe Rogan saying the N-word is a January 6th moment, meaning that it's the worst possible thing. It said, in fact, it might be more dangerous than January 6th was, which maybe that's actually true, but in the weirdly ironic way. So I think that they've imbibed this mentality. I believe, frankly, that Marxism of all types is an entitlement complex masquerading as a political and social theory. And so this entitlement to be able to apply their theory and to apply power is characteristic of everything they're doing.
And this, of course, explains, I think for a lot of people that aren't inclined to this ideology, let's say, they're kind of all flummoxed when they say something that might not be polite and they're called a racist immediately, or some very extreme expletive or something, right? Most people just don't know how to deal with that, right? And I guess it's a way to also kind of bully people, right?
There's a number of things you can say. At the very first line of race Marxism, I actually give 3 definitions for critical race theory of my own invention. And the first of them is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. And so this is a form of bullying, and it is exactly what this is, but it's also Maoism, and people just don't recognize it. This is the recreation of Mao's black identity categories versus red identity categories. Somebody says something you don't like, it used to be you're bourgeois, you have bourgeois values, you're rightist, you're counter-revolutionary, you're somehow tied in with the dirty capitalists. And for Mao, he had these black categories like rich farmer, landlord, etc., counter-revolutionary, bad influence, which that's pretty open-ended. He had these categories, and if he didn't like you got categorized in those, your children got categorized in them, people who associated you got stained by association. And then on the other hand, you have these other identities that you can adopt, and you can become a revolutionary. You can't necessarily become a laborer or a peasant. Those were 2 of his red identities, glorified because of it being traditional Marxism with Chinese characteristics now. But you can join the movement and you can get out of this accusation that's being laid upon you. Same thing's happening here. You're a racist, you're a sexist, you're a transphobe, you're a straight white male. Your story has been told, etc., etc. These are just so-called black identity categories that are shunned and scapegoated and that cause moral pollution or epistemic pollution or whatever kind of psychological pollution. And then what can you do? You can become an ally. You can become, you can do the work. Study the critical race theory, do the work, interrogate your own whiteness, check your privilege. You have all these different things that you can do. You could also, adopt. You can't change your race. They get really upset about that, but you can change your sexuality. You can change your gender identification. They give you lots of options, and then you can become political in your identity. They give you lots of options. This is people are not used to being called racist on false pretenses, but they also lack the ability to recognize that this is the exact cultural revolution roadmap that Mao Zedong laid out. So this is, again, why do I call it race Marxism? It is the same tool in a different context that Marxists used in the past.
What strikes me with this, right, is that on the one hand, you have this menu that allows you to actually become one of the red groups, so to speak. If you're in one of the grab groups, you can become a revolutionary of sorts. But at the same time, if you are in one of the red groups, sort of these intrinsic red groups, you can be thrown back into the black groups very easily.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so to speak.
Exactly.
I'm talking about Mao's definitions of red and black
course,
here, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like Larry Elder ran for governor of California. LA Times runs an article, and I know that gets trotted out a lot, but runs an article saying, he's the black face of white supremacy now, which is preposterous. Why? Because he's conservative. And so he holds black bourgeois values, if you will, if we put it back in the kind of the Marxist language. Dave Chappelle, I like to bring this is my favorite example, makes jokes about trans people in one of his specials. And so they write an article, and I forget which outlet this is in, it was a smaller outlet, but they say that he told the jokes from a position of his white privilege, which is, hugely hilarious, but it's because he's rich and he's famous, and so he has what we used to call FU money, and so that's white privilege. And so he has a position of white, Dave Chappelle, black comedian, has a position of white privilege, and he tells trans jokes from that position. Kind of more seriously, though, as far as how that goes with the, this menu of politicized identities you can take up. We got the I love that the Capitol's right behind me. So we can reference people that work there. Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, for example, said, we don't want to have any more black faces who don't want to be black voices. We don't want to have any more brown faces who don't want to be brown voices. In other words, they have to become politically active in their race, the way that critical race theory says that they have to become politically active. Why? Because it's Marxist. Marxism believes that there's a superstructure and infrastructure of society, not to get too deep here, but the interaction between those, that's his dialectical materialism. The interaction between the two strata of society creates a structure of social relations, and that structure of social relations actually conditions who you are. Your contents of character that Martin Luther King invoked are conditioned by your structural position. That's Marxist with regard to economic class, if it's old Marxism, but now it's with regard to racial class within critical race theory. And it's exactly the same. So they literally have a term for this. In Marxism, they called it material determinism. Your material conditions determined how you were as a person. Now they call it structural determinism. The existence of whiteness as a form of property creates an ideology called white supremacy that tries to keep it in power, or keep white people and other people that they give access to whiteness to in power. And so you have a racial bourgeoisie that has access to bourgeois racial property called whiteness, and you have a proletariat and the people of color, a racial proletariat, and their interactions across this stratification cause a structural racism in society that is a system that pervades everything. It's embedded in the laws, it's embedded in the language, it's embedded in how we think about ideas, what we consider to be true and false, what we consider knowledge, how we consider the production of knowledge to be valid and invalid. There's this entire system. And so when she says we don't want to have black faces that don't want to be black voices, what she's saying is critical race theory, as the only theory in town that understands the structural nature of racism, understands what it means to be black in a way, political way, that nothing else does. And so if they're not going to speak into their blackness the way that critical race theory says they should, they must somehow be adopting the ideology of white supremacy. And so Larry Elder becomes the black face of white supremacy because he's speaking into the ideology.